Hello Petplan viewers, and a very warm welcome on this Sunday afternoon. It's the Sunday 30th of September at 3 p.m. and outside it's a lovely winter's afternoon, and I am here today to help you with your dog behaviour questions. So I have with me this afternoon my helpful assistant Kim, who has her lemsip in hand, so hopefully we will get through this in one piece today. But Kim, do you have the first question for me, please? Thank you.
Yes. Nick, the first question today is from Christine Rockingham, and she's asking, how would you suggest dealing with a reactive dog who is good with other animals and welcomes them into his home, but barks at dogs when he's actually out?
Okay, well that's a nice opening question, because the subject of reactivity in dogs is so common, and as I often explain we might have a general umbrella heading that we could give that heading aggression to dogs, but of course the dog could still fall within that spectrum but not actually be biting or overtly aggressive. So we might have within that spectrum dogs that just might bark at other dogs, as you're indicating, or we could have a dog going all the way through to the other end of the spectrum where we have some really quite serious and worrying behaviour. But what you're describing is at the relatively, or it sounds to me to be at the relatively thinner edge of, or end of the spectrum in terms of that reactivity to dogs. So it's a positive that you can bring other animals into your household. And incidentally, broadly speaking, that should, if we have any questions or uncertainties about how our dogs might react if we bring another dog or a cat into the house, I would always advocate, if possible, making those meetings on neutral territory away from the home. But when we do bring the dogs into the home, to have them both on the lead so we have some safe control and that the owners can oversee this situation safely and calmly. Okay, so that's just a quick tip about introducing animals in the home. If you are finding that your dog is just barking at other dogs in public, and I'll assume, let's say it's when your dog is on a short lead and you are seeing other dogs maybe coming towards you or on the other side of the pavement, this is, depending on your dog, relatively easy to address with some practice and some time and effort. If you have a dog which is food driven, then I would always look to use food, and thankfully most dogs are food driven. I would always look to use food so that we can use that food in 3 different ways. We would use high value food, such as little bits of chicken or liver, something you know is really special for your dog. A dog I worked with recently was particularly keen on carrots, so off we went armed with little batons of carrot. So you need the high value food, but that food, when you see another dog, will help you install a different behaviour or a different response than your dog has previously been showing. So in essence, we'll be saying to the dog, don't do that by going down that road and or route rather, and bark and be reactive. Let's come over to one side. We'll sit down. If the dog won't sit, I wouldn't stress about it, but most dogs will, I find. And that we can use that high value food to distract the dog, to keep the dog's attention whilst the other dog passes, and then to reward that dog for calm behaviour. And that I find usually with enough practice and some looking ahead and repetition and really being devoted to that little method, we can go a great way to settling the dog down. And this can help deal with that sort of just low level reactivity where your dog may be barking at other dogs. Just because your dog's barking at other dogs, it doesn't necessarily mean that the intent behind the bark is an unpleasant one. Many dogs will just bark out of excitement and frustration that they want to go over and play, but of course the dog can't because it's on a lead. Okay, so I hope I've a couple of assumptions on my part there, and I hope they're correct. But that is my method for dealing with that type of behaviour. Incidentally, if food isn't the thing for your dog, some dogs will then respond positively for a toy. okay, a favourite toy, something like, imagine a squeaky ball on a rope that you could keep in your pocket, and when your dog sees another dog, you can gain your dog's attention, so you're using the same attention keeping and distraction methods, but actually instead of feeding your dog, we are providing distraction with a toy. And so you may give your dog a little tussle and a play for the passing and completion of the passing of the other dog, and then once that's finished, you can take the toy, put it back in your pocket. Okay, it is important that you maintain control of that device, because you need to keep the specialness around it there for your dog. Okay, so hope that helps. Good luck with that. Please let us know how you get on. So what do we have next, Kim?
Okay, well, we've got Helen Wilding, who has a border collie, and the border collie runs up to young children and barks. He's just over 2 years old. The more the children run faster, the more upset he seems to get.
Okay, thank you. This is a really good question. I mean, all of the questions are good, but I'm particularly passionate about the subject of dogs and children because I'm a parent myself, and having well-balanced dogs that we can take out into public spaces is really important. Not to mention, of course, for safety issues, and we cannot have dogs chasing children in the park. Putting it simply, it could theoretically land you in some quite hot water. Under the Dangerous Dogs Act, at risk of going off on a slightly heavier tangent, a dog does not have to bite a person for it to actually commit an offence under the Dangerous Dogs Act. So a dog can, if a dog is found to place a person in reasonable fear that they may be bitten, even if that was on the behalf of a parent for their child, then in theory you will have to answer to that offence. So anyway, we'll put that to one side, but it is worth being aware of the bigger picture, because that's a part of my work as well. Fundamentally, you're lacking control with the dog. It's putting it simply, because what's happening is that your dog is loose. The dog sees a child off at a distance, and your dog's chasing the children, and of course you, I am absolutely sure, are calling the dog, but the dog is disregarding you and zipping off and rounding up children. So it is slightly a breed-specific trait in collies. Only this week I saw a collie-type dog that would do just that very thing, and it would bark at the children, but it was not being aggressive. So what we actually need to do here is to come back on ourselves. You will need to ask yourself, how good is my dog's recall? And forgive me for making assumptions, but would assume that the recall is not as good as it could be, because if it was, you could stop the dog, call it back, no problem, and then you would be able to circumnavigate the children or to move off in a completely different direction. So how do you make the recall good again, or how do we establish a good recall? Well, as I just was saying, we need to come back on ourselves and start from the beginning. I would introduce the concept of a long training line. For a dog of that sort of breed that's adult and moving around quite a lot, I would look online and purchase a line that is a good 50 feet in length as a minimum. The typical lengths I find online are 30 foot and 50 foot. 50 I seem to favour overall. And we then need a 3-stage development with the recall. Stage 1 is that for a month at least, we hold the line and practice recalling the dog. So we recall. It's a very repetitive process, but the timing of your recall is worth talking about, because we can call the dog when there's actually nothing going on, and then also we can call the dog back when we know that the dog is distracted. If the dog is sniffing something, or maybe you spot that your dog stops and is focusing on something in the distance, that would be a good time for you to call your dog back. There's 2 things are going to happen when you call your dog. The first possibility is that you call the dog and it will instantly come back to you, at which point ideally we bring the dog into our feet. We're not looking for anything sort of Crufts obedience, but we want it looking quite tidy. We bring our dog into our feet, ask it to sit, put your foot on the end of the line so the dog can't just zip off again. And then if your dog is food driven, we can use food, or we can have a little tussle with that toy, as I was just touching on. And then there you have it. So that is the nice outcome for the recall. The other option, which could be more likely for you at the moment, is that your dog ignores you entirely. Well, that is where you can give your dog a tug. Nothing aggressive, nothing heavy-handed. We're not looking to bring our dog off our feet, but we are looking to enforce the recall. So get the dog facing you, and as soon as your dog's facing you, you'll need to put lots of emphasis on your body language and your voice and your facial expressions, and to let the dog know that you've got something high value for its efforts. So if necessary, it might be a little bit of hand over hand to bring the dog in. But this is an important stage, because your dog may have learnt that the recall doesn't really mean that he has to come back immediately, but in fact, the subtext with the recall, that sort of unspoken element with our dog, means now, because there can be some urgency behind the need to get your dog back. Okay, so step 1 is you're holding the line whilst doing the recall. Step 2 is at the end of that month, if you can say he really is a much, much better dog and he's coming back reliably, then you could entertain the thought of letting the line go. Incidentally, if you feel you need to do 2 months at stage 1 of holding the line, then do it, okay? Only let go of the line when you honestly think your dog's ready to go solo, as it were. And then during stage 2, where your dog is dragging the line on the floor, you will be continuing with your recalls. If he ignores you, you can jump on the line, lift it and enforce the recall, as I mentioned earlier. Or if you're really struggling a bit, as I say, you may need to go back to stage 1 for a longer period. Stage 3 is after a month of this, or again a bit longer, you might think, okay, he's ready to have the line off. You can either just take it all off in one go, and there you have a loose dog, which you'll need to keep a close eye on and to test his recalls. Or for slightly more difficult cases, we might cut the line down gradually over a few weeks, because dogs can't measure, but we are getting the line off it in a longer term way. So those are the 3 stages: the holding, the dragging, and then ultimately the removal of the line whilst we're rewarding those recalls. In terms of addressing the dog's behaviour around children specifically, then because it's such a broad subject and there's so many subtleties involved, I would actually advise you to contact a qualified behaviourist. You're welcome to email me, nickjones@alphadogbehaviour.co.uk, and I will point you in the right direction if you're not in my location. Okay, so I hope that helps you, and at least it gives you the control and prevents your dog from just running around causing chaos and you feeling that you have no control, and obviously all the upsets and anxieties that come around with that specific behaviour of dogs chasing children. Okay, so I hope that helps. Thank you for the question.
Okay, so Lorraine Ackhurst asks, she says, I've just rescued 2 Jack Russells, mum and son. They are very well behaved, and we've had other Jack Russells, so we know how to look after them. But Bonnie, the mother, who is 6.5, it's her 3rd rescue home, and she hates Lorraine's 33-year-old son. She's nipped him on the back of his legs, and when he comes in she hides and backs up. How can she settle her? He gives her treats when he comes. Bonnie's son, who is 4, is so loving and fine with anyone. Any words of advice would be great. Okay,
Lorraine, so thank you for that question. Well done, really, for firstly taking on a rescue dog. A dog that has been previously rescued 3 times does suggest that the dog is a bit of a bouncer, in as much that it's being rehomed and people are discovering problems with the dog's behaviour and coming to the conclusion that it's more than they can deal with, or that they don't have the tools, either financially or experience-wise, to deal with that behaviour. Again, it may be a case where you need somebody to come and look at what's happening in situ, but here are some sort of headliner thoughts for you. We can't, of course, allow the dog to nip anybody, because, yet again, because we're on the subject of aggression to people, the Dangerous Dogs Act does apply. The Dangerous Dogs Act was changed in recent years so that it now incorporates behaviour that your dog displays within the home environment, whereby previously private homes didn't apply to the Dangerous Dogs Act, although there were other acts that could cover it. So we do need a dog that's safe. I would say to introduce gradually over a week or two, because I'm assuming from what you, or gather from what you say, that your son isn't coming over, doesn't live there, he comes to visit with his son. So I would spend a week or two introducing a muzzle to the dog, because safety first is our absolute priority. We need to know, and actually we also need the dog to know, that trying to bite is futile, and that of course it can't happen. The other thing to do in terms of those headlining thoughts is to make sure your dog is on the lead when your son enters the room, and so that you have physical control, okay? Because that the lead and the muzzle will address fully, really, the safety issue. Jack Russell, I know they can be quite big, but as they go, they will put them in the small dog category. So we know that at least we can manage the dog physically if it's on a lead and if the dog is muzzled. So that's what you do. You keep the dog away from your son. What can happen in well-meaning situations, and it sounds like this could be happening with you, is that we are making great efforts, or the person that's having the problem with the dog is making great efforts to befriend the dog. And I understand the logic in that, and there is some mileage in that approach. However, I've found over the years that we can have more improvements by doing, ironically, nothing. And what I mean by that is that we're taking all the pressure off the dog. We're not trying to make friends with the dog. We are ignoring the dog entirely. So you as the owner, Lorraine, would be managing the dog as it's on the lead and muzzled, and your son will also be entirely ignoring the dog. And I would have a little situation where you're, say, sat down in the lounge, you could have the dog at your feet, you could yeah, sorry, I'm just getting distracted my own thoughts there. So your dog would be at your feet, and your son would just be engaging with you and ignoring the dog entirely. And I would go down that road a few times. We can also do other little things, such as if you are fully confident that the dog is on the lead, you could take the muzzle off and provide, if your dog is a real foodie, and because I've had success with this, is that you get a hollow rubber toy and you stuff it with some really interesting food. Have a look online for things like toy stuffing recipes for dogs, and you come up with some nice little recipes. Because if your dog was able to be so distracted in a positive way that she was in the world of emptying that device instead of worrying about your son, then that would begin to build up a much more positive association. But I would give it a month or two doing that, depending on how frequently your son is coming over. And then we could begin to sort of up the game a little later on by your son dropping in food, or maybe meeting your son and going out for walks, so that there is this positive association coming through. Okay, so I hope that helps. Incidentally, folks, if you can share the stream and like the post, that would be very helpful, because it does send out the internet juices across Facebook and lets other people know that we're here helping you today with your dog questions. And also, just to interrupt myself, we have today from 5 p.m. to 6 p.m. Live questions and answers over at the Petplan's Puppy Centre page. This can be found at facebook.com/puppy centre. If you go there between 5 and 6 p.m, you'll see me again answering your puppy questions, so which I love. So dealing with adult dog questions and then looking at puppies in a separate broadcast, if you like, is an absolutely lovely way to do it. So I hope to see you at 5 o'clock as well. So Kim, what else do you have?
This is from Shirley Scottick, and she says, my dog has lots of assorted toys but still takes things that aren't hers. Desperate for advice, thank you. So goodness knows what this little dog is taking, but
Yes.
Shelley needs some help.
Yes, okay. Good question. And I think often this can happen if there are children in the home, and that might be, at a guess, what's going on. Because if we have children's toys on the floor and then dogs' toys on the floor, how, to be fair, is the dog to know what is what, and it can become very confusing. There isn't an easy answer to this, but I found over the years that one of the best ways to address it is through organisation. And so what I mean by that is that we have a box for the dog's toys and a box of whatever size for the baby's toys as well, or the children's toys, okay? And that at least once a day that they are all put in their respective boxes. And that I would encourage you not to have too many items out at one time, okay? So that can really help clarify what's what. You know, in my own home, I have two dogs. I have little Pip, the Border Terrier, and I have Max, the Wirehead Vizsla. They're both older dogs, but we don't really have dog toys strewn around. It's very much an emphasis placed upon exercise, away from the home, and then when they are home, they're out for the count. They're tired and they're calm and they're quiet. If we do give them any sort of food type devices, then usually I would either put them out in the garden and I can watch them here from the office. I have a window here and I can see down onto the garden. So that sort of approach might help you. So don't feel duty bound to have an absolute huge number of toys for your dog, because your dog can only play or use one device at a time anyway. So there's some food for thought there for you. In terms of if there are no children in the home and you're really thinking more about the dog picking up other items in the home, then a question for you is, will the dog release those items? Because that can happen. People might say to me, well, he'll get the TV remote but not give it back to me. So that can be a particular issue that you may like to consider. But generally speaking, it's really a case of making sure that everything is up and out of the way, and that the dog understands more clearly what is his and what isn't, because you are helping it through being more organised, okay? So I realise that's not a very clever dog behaviour answer, but there are so many practical elements to managing our dogs and their behaviour in the home that these sort of more practical elements can make all the difference. So I do hope that helps. Let me know in the comments if I'm missing anything there, and I'll come back to it later for you. Thank you. What do we have next, Kim?
Well, this is one I think we've get quite a lot, so let's have a look at it. Specifically, Fiona Louise Boyle has asked, how do you stop a dog barking every time the doorbell goes?
Wow, this is so common. It comes up on a great number of my visits. There are stopping the dog barking at the doorbell. Have a look on my YouTube channel, /Alpha Dog Behaviour. I have a couple of videos there specifically about desensitizing the dogs barking at the doorbell, because this does come up a lot. Now, there are a few different ways we can go about it. One of my favourite ways, and I'm going to go down this road with you, is that you proactively desensitize the dog to the doorbell. What people have physically on their door structure outside for the caller to use varies a great deal. Some people just have good old-fashioned knockers that they can use at various heights throughout the door. Some people have like a little letter flap that they use that. People will use that, and others might have an old wired system that's plugged into the mains and that works within the house. But what I'm seeing more of, and this is what I really favour, is the electronic remote doorbells, which are wireless. So the chiming unit is either plugged into the wall, or it's battery powered, or both, and the unit on the front of the house has a couple of batteries in it. Even if you have that system already, I would often encourage the users to take the doorbell off and to bring it inside the house, and I'll explain why in a moment. If the user doesn't have a wireless doorbell system, I encourage them to get one, because it allows you to set up a new habit, and that can be in itself quite useful, because we have a new tone, that we have an opportunity to start the dog with a clean slate, as it were. So the simple point here is, and I won't go into super detail, but throughout the day you will, let's say, have the doorbell on the mantelpiece in the lounge, okay, or somewhere in the kitchen, or even in your pocket in your trousers, and that you can randomly press the bell, but you will need to ensure that you have some high value food on you, and also that you're well within sight of your dog. Another little tip that can help is that your dog is dragging a relatively short lead in the home, because that lead will allow you to step on it, lift it up, and to redirect the dog's physical behaviour, which is important. So the simple process would be, the dog is within your reach, and you think, yes, I can maybe stand on the lead, or you might even subtly pick it up. You then press the button, activating the doorbell. Your dog will inevitably, because it's conditioned to do so, it will bark and maybe try to run to the door. But what you will do instead is that you'll guide your dog onto its bed using simple commands: on your bed, sit, stay, and then when the dog is not barking and you've had a few seconds of calmness and quiet, you can lean in and reward the dog for that calm behaviour. Okay, so what with practice and how much practice, how frequently, I would say if you were at home during the day, I would aim to do this 2 or 3 times a day, maybe 2 or 3 times each. Okay, so there's a sense of randomness. The dog really doesn't know when it's happening, but because you're activating the doorbell, you can get ahead of the curve. You can, instead of being reactive, you're being much more proactive, and this is something I really like, the concept of where whatever the behaviour, that we're being proactive, not reactive, because if we're having to react to a situation, we are by definition always having to play catch up, so to speak. But this proactive method allows you to activate the bell, and when you know it's coming, and you can get those precious few seconds where you can direct your dog onto its bed, and to sit and to stay, possibly even to lie down. And once you've got that calm behaviour, then you can reward it. Okay, once the dog's in the bed, I mean, there's no definitive method on how to do this, but I like to mix and match things up a little bit and test the dog, and to try to chase down little elements of that behaviour so that you really feel satisfied you're on top of it. But even once the dog is on the bed, you could press the bell again. Okay, press the bell when the dog is in different areas in the home. Press the bell when you are even, where I'll often start, so I'll open the front door, be stood in that space, holding the dog on the lead, and even if the dog sees me use the knocker, they will often bark, because we have that conditioned response. But usually with a few sessions, the dog will settle down, and you can reduce that behaviour from really annoying and frustrating to something which is very manageable within a week or so. And then with persistent effort, you should be able to get right to the point where you can send your dog onto the bed. It doesn't have to be perfect, but as long as at least you're able to say, oh, that's enough, on your bed, and for you to feel that you have just that little bit of extra control, it can make all the difference. We don't expect our dogs to be utterly silent in the home, but again, it's nice to be able to say thank you, on your bed, stay, and for you to feel that you can in some way control it, or to turn it off, and that your dog isn't becoming overly excessive in his behaviours. Anything that we feel is excessive, regardless of what the behaviour is, it does pay to look at the various ways in which we might be able to reduce that dog's excessive behaviours. Okay, most of my day-to-day work is looking at reducing behaviours that are defined in some way as excessive, and we have a whole invisible toolbox of ways in which we can do that, because we're looking in its place to create what I often term as calm control. you'll often find that when you speak to trainers or behaviour people, that we ultimately all come to the same point of view, in that we're looking for calmness in the dog. Does the owner have control of the dog? And it doesn't matter what the behaviour is, because people would only usually seek my help if something is seemed or deemed as excessive. Okay, so just a little off at a tangent there, but I think it's relevant. Okay, thank you though for the question, nice one.
And here's another one actually that is also about excessive behaviour. So
Excessive behaviour.
Hi, this is from Vicky Lorick. Hi, my usually lovely, gentle Jack Russell goes absolutely psycho when we get his harness out to take him for a walk. He's so bad it takes 2 people to put it on. What can we do?
A psycho terrier. Who would have thought it? Okay, so sometimes we can, and I'm saying sometimes because I think the ideas here are me giving you suggestions for you to go away and try. Do we really have... I'm pro harnesses, but the question for you is, do you really need to use one? How would it work for you and the dog if, for example, the dog was wearing a soft collar throughout the day, and that you either produced a lead where you could within 2 seconds just lean over, go clip, and it's on, and the dog is then on a collar and a lead, and that you can then leave the house in a calm way. I think I'll come back to that for you in a moment, about leaving the house calmly, because it's relevant. And you may find that taking a different approach solves the problem altogether. Of course, your dog isn't then in a harness, and if your dog is in a harness for any particular reason, we may then need to address that as well. Another crafty little method is to use a little slip lead. And the nice thing about it, there's pros and cons for all of these methods, but the nice thing about a slip lead is that you can open it up and just effectively drop it over your dog's head and just gently cinch it, and you have your dog there on the lead. The trouble, of course, as my words indicated, is that with a slip lead, there's nothing really stopping it because it can restrict the dog and it can get tighter and tighter, especially if the dog is behaving in a particularly excitable manner, let's call it. It's a polite way, polite exchange for the word psycho. So yeah, that could be a disadvantage with the slip lead, okay? Another thought, and these are all just random thoughts as they come into my mind, is that you let the dog wear the harness a lot more, and that you keep the harness on the dog. Maybe, I think this is okay to suggest this, maybe 24/7, or at least 24 hours a day for a few days. Because that would certainly bypass the issue of getting it on and off. It would remove the dog's overly excitable association with the harness, because of course your dog is associating the harness with going out, and I'm guessing that you are just dealing with a hyper excitable dog. Some dogs can become a bit aggressive when we try to put equipment like this on and off, but you've not mentioned that, so we'll stick to the subject of hyper excitement, okay? So yes, keeping the harness on for 2 or 3 days may help. If you are concerned, my only hesitation there is at night times. And you may even find it a great deal easier thinking, well, 10, 11 p.m. at night, the dog is very calm. You might just subtly unclip that collar and to just take the harness off. Obviously getting it off is much easier than putting it on, but I think there could be some mileage in doing that. Okay, so a few days of back-to-back use of the harness. So in summary, would a normal lead with a clip onto the dog's collar work okay, and that could circumnavigate the whole problem? Would a slip lead be okay, because that will go on even more quickly? Would it help, and I think I would try it personally, by leaving that harness on for a few days, and then that could be a good way forward for you. if you were to keep the harness on for a few days, I would, again, if your dog is food driven, I would get a little dish of chicken pieces, and when the dog is calm in the day or in the evening if you work, have the dog sit on the floor with the dog and slowly feed the dog in return for you doing little things like pressing the clips, the plastic clips, which tend to make a very specific hollow plasticky sound when they go in and out. But I would just take it apart and clip it together, take it apart, don't take the harness off, but just do things that are in and around the harness, where you sort of begin to build confidence yourself that the dog is calm and under your control. Okay, so that could help you. You may be using a harness because your dog pulls a lot when you're out on the walk. I realise that. So there are head harnesses as well that could, by introducing that, I want to make things easier for you, not more complicated, but sometimes introducing a head harness may be easier for your dog than a body harness, although I have to say I would usually prefer to go the other way around. And the other thing to consider is whether you just need some simple, good old-fashioned training so that your dog is walking to heel nicely for you. And if that was the case, if we could train that in, then we could do away with the harness altogether, and you would be in a much more traditional, I realise it's a preferential thing, but we'd be much more traditional scenario of a soft dog lead, a soft collar, everything's good, your dog's walking nicely with you, and again, it solves the problem. The other thing I wanted to say finally is the way you're leaving the home. Please don't allow your dog you open the door and your dog is ramming its nose through that bit of daylight as the door opens and pushing out ahead of you, and that again, the dog is indulging itself in that very excitable behaviour. If your dog is doing that, just be careful that you don't catch your dog's nose or feet in the door jamb, but just shut the door each time your dog you open the door a little. So open the door an inch or two. If he's pushing his nose there, just shut the door gently, and do this on a repetitive basis. I usually find that it might take you a few minutes, but the dog will settle down, because what we're trying to say to the dog is, once you're calm and not pulling out ahead of me, we will go out through the door. Okay, so ideally, I usually find that with a lot of repetition with this, opening and shutting, that the dog will eventually look up to me as if to say, what are we doing? Or I think they say with that look, oh, okay, I think I understand, you go first then, okay? Because I really want the dog to be calm and polite, okay, that's important. So using that little door technique is ideal. Once you think you can open the door enough, slip in front of the dog, turn to face the dog, then count to about 5, just in your head, or 5, and then you can say to the dog, come on then. And that may either lead you up to another door. Some homes have porches, so we've got an internal door and a porch door. So do it at both doorways, and then even make sure the gate is shut if there is a gate at the end of the driveway, because I like to use exactly the same method, because that's essential. And the reason I touch on this doorway thing is that whenever anybody presents me with a dog that is a particularly determined puller, I virtually always find that the dog is leaving the home in a bit of a hyper state. So it stands to reason, and in practice it works, that if you can get your dog to leave the home calmly, then your dog's behaviour out on the street, whether it's pulling or indeed reactivity to other dogs or people, as we were touching on at the beginning of this session, that is going to be so much easier to manage, because we left the home and set in a calm way, and we set your dog's expectations from the beginning. Okay, so who would have thought that such an innocent question could result in such a long answer? But it's important, I think, that or that you are given some of these ideas and tools, and maybe that we don't just blindly focus on the problem, that we look at the outer elements that are inevitably affecting that problem. And so it stands to reason that if we calmly address those as well, that allows your main effort to be much more successful, or the likelihood of that. Okay, so thank you again.
Okay, This question's from Angela Jane Stewart, Bookser. My beautiful black lab Margot, who's 18 months old, suffers with what we think is nervous excitement stroke anxiety when travelling in the car. She jumps in, no problem. She just wants to be with us, but as soon as we set off, she cries, whimpers, and pants very heavily. My husband wants to carry on and says she will get used to it, but I feel that that's cruel. Any advice? We've tried calming tablets and a Daptol spray, but they don't seem to make any difference.
Okay, good. So there are some pros or positives in what you're describing. The main one being that she will jump up of her own accord. If, let's say for example, that was not happening and that you could not get her in, or at least not easily, that would be a whole new level of difficulty for you to overcome. And it does occur in some dogs. So, well, we can tick that element because that's good. She'll get in there nicely. But the difficulty for you is that she is not travelling well once you're up and moving. And that, in theory and in practice, is doable. But you will need an approach that you think we need a consistent approach to this. So I'll try to break that down for you. I would agree with the element of having a daily practice, but when addressing dog behaviour problems, we always want to address them in a gradual way. It's unreasonable for us to expect a dog to just get over it and to overcome themselves in 1 or 2 sessions. Dogs can't compute things or think things through or rationalise things in the way that we can. But we have the advantage of being able to do that for them, if that makes sense. So what I mean is that we need to look at what we want eventually. So eventually you may say, well, I would like to be able to take my dog on a 10-minute trip to the forest and to have a nice walk and then to have a 10-minute trip back. Or that, and your dog may not be coping with that at the moment. Or we could say also, because this, and I think once you've got the 10 minutes, then you would be able to consider, well, we would like eventually to drive from the Midlands to Devon on holiday. And of course that's going to be a number of hours to get there each way. But we need to take these things one thing at a time. That's why I'm giving this concept of taking it gradually and having stages. So once your dog is in the car, I would have a set location for it. You may find that the dog travels in some places better than others. My personal preference, it depends on the vehicle of course, but is to lift the hatch of the back of the vehicle, to put the dog in there, to have it nice and safe, a dog grill there, and that the dog travels in the back. Some people like, and I don't have a problem with this, their dogs travelling on the back seat. If you do that, I would encourage you to get some sort of hammock type liner, which are readily available online, and also to ensure that your dog is secured. There is a legal requirement for your dog to be secured in the vehicle. And you can achieve the securement, by the way, by having a body harness that is clipped into an appropriate seatbelt buckle. Okay, so that can help. I don't have you here to ask questions and to get direct feedback from, I'm sorry. But I would suggest that you have, as to give you some sort of framework, to have 2 or 3 5-minute sessions per day. If your dog really is that bad in the car, I wouldn't even drive off initially. I might just have the dog in the car for 5 minutes and then come out. But when the dog is in the car, and again, you'll need to use some experimentation for your end, but think about the using, as I mentioned earlier to somebody else, a hollow rubber toy that can be stuffed with really high value soft food. Okay, and I have had some dogs that don't travel well, but that they were so into their food, and I think this was a black lab, wasn't it? So we all know that what labs can be like. They're not all the same, but very often they are driven by their stomach. And if you can just have a short drive that only lasts long enough to go around the block, as I say, 5 minutes, whilst the dog is distracted entirely into that world of emptying that device, that could be the beginning, the first step of you building something up. And so you could do that once or twice, maybe 3 times a day, depending on your availability and your lifestyle. And then I would keep a little log of this as you go, by the way, and then build it up to something like 7 to 10 minutes, okay? And don't rush it. Just each week add on maybe feelings of 5 minutes extra. If it takes you a month or maybe 2 months to get to something that feels like long enough to get you to the forest and back, and then eventually more, then that is the way forward. I would personally do it every day. Although I did read something just recently which I thought was quite smart about maybe having off days from training, you know, not so that we're not bombarding our dogs and indeed ourselves with the sorts of programs so much that because that in itself can cause additional stress. So you'll need to sort of use your discretion and common sense as you go, but in summary, yes, I would look at daily with a day off in the week somewhere. I would do 2 or 3 sessions a day, 5 minutes to begin with, build them up as you go, give your dog something to consume and see if that helps. Even if it doesn't help, let's imagine that we didn't have food to use in these situations. Well, I just think by sheer repetition and getting the dog used to it will in itself help move forward. I recall with my own dog Max, he used to be quite sick as a puppy and car travel, and the short way I overcame that was I just took him out everywhere with me every day, or at least as close to that as possible, and eventually he did grow out of it. But he only grew out of it because I was absolutely determined that, well, he had to, you know, having my cars having my dogs in the car is really important, not just for my work, but because we often holiday within the UK. So my overall optimistic comment to leave you with is stick with it, and it will get better. I'm certain of it. Usually things like other supplements and things that can help with car travel. I am a pro of these sorts of fan of these products, but I'm not so sure they help very often, and the best thing we can do is to really work on the daily ritual and that daily practice. So good luck, go for it, and it will come together, I'm sure. Thank you.
Lovely. This is from Julie Stevenson. My 11-year-old Staffy is terrified of thunder and fireworks, which of course is something that will be very current soon. He shakes, he pants, and he's terrified. He had a mild stroke a month ago, and she's worried when firework night comes whether he'll be in a state of anxiety. Please, could you give her some advice?
Yeah, I feel for you. I've actually interestingly helped a lot of Staffordshire Bull Terrier owners with this sort of aversion, and it can be so distressing. Some people say, well, my dog doesn't like fireworks, and if that person isn't particularly a pet lover or a dog owner, they just have no idea how severe the reaction to these sounds can be. The problem is, of course, is that in built-up areas especially, we can have a fireworks season that starts any time now, frankly, towards the beginning of October, and that can then run all the way through into the new year. I'm not sure about religious ceremonies, but they can also have an impact on dogs as well, because fireworks are used increasingly in those sorts of situations. So if a dog does suffer with that aversion to fireworks, then it can have a really big impact. It's not good, of course, that your dog, was it actually a stroke that the dog had?
Yeah, about a month ago.
Yeah, so you know your dog is quite possibly in a delicate place at the moment. You may want to seek advice from your vet. I'm not a fan of medicating dogs for anything of a behavioural nature. I prefer to address the behaviour, because that is the preferred way, because we recondition the dog, and I'll come on to that for you shortly. But under the circumstances, if you feel there's something, or if your vet feels there's something you can do, then that is worth considering. I live here, as a by the way, in a relatively quiet area, but once or twice there's a business near me that will let off fireworks, thankfully just on the firework weekend, but I personally I know when they're going to go off, so I put both dogs in the car because Big Max just doesn't cope with it. It's almost like World War III here. And we go in the car and we drive off out into the countryside. And for an hour or so, that is the best way to deal with it. There isn't a big enough problem for me to put endless hours into desensitizing it, because I can manage it in that way. So, and I only raise that because, is that an option for you given the delicateness and the severity of what you're describing? Of course, we would benefit from addressing the behaviour, but if you can frankly avoid the problem altogether, given that it may be a short-lived thing for you, that could be worth considering. In terms of desensitizing a dog to fireworks, and I won't go through, I don't have enough time to go through all the steps here, but I am otherwise a great fan of desensitizing dogs to those sounds using CDs that can be purchased online. If you have a quick Google around, you will come up with quite a few CDs that either focus purely on fireworks, and what they will have done is to record displays and then to play them in set pieces on the CD. Or also the CD may include other things like aircraft, lorries, cars. It may have things like gunshot, crop scarers, things like white goods in the house, like washing machines, vacuum cleaners. So incidentally, that if you have a puppy, and we may touch on this later with the puppy centre questions and answers as we go live then, is it desensitizing a dog from the very beginning before there's a problem, hence again this proactive rather than reactive approach, can be a very smart move, because we are building up the dog's confidence and it's used to those sounds before it hears them in an uncontrolled way later on. But the essence behind the desensitization CD is that you play it each time on a daily basis, and that you would usually look to ally the playing of the CD with keeping your dog distracted. Most staffies, in my experience, are real little foodies, and if you can keep your dog distracted through eating something or gaining access to food for the duration of the playing of the CD, that is an excellent way forward. The essence of the idea with the CD is that you play it at a volume in the first use so that it's barely perceptible in your dog. I would, if you had, let's say, a little rotary turner for a volume, you will need to play the CD, just interrupting myself, you'll need to play the CD on a decent sound system. It's no good getting out a little £15 CD player with a couple of tinny speakers, because it won't sound accurate to the dog. You may need to consider something like a DVD player that usually play MP3 CDs, and then for it to come through a decent sound system, okay, so it does sound realistic. But we just, on the first occasion, raise the volume just to the point where we see the dog's ears are tweaking and twizzling. We know that the dog can hear it. The dog might stop doing what it's doing, and then we back it off a little, okay, and then play the CD at that level. You will know if your dog's okay, because ideally he or she will be emptying that food device, okay? And then over each successive, or maybe every other few days, you would just tweak the volume up. Keep a little note of the volume levels that you're playing, and it's the sort of thing that I like to keep a diary for as well, so you have some sort of objective feedback as time goes on, okay? So desensitization is the way forward. There are lots of different elements to this subject, more than I can really cover in detail, but with severe cases, and we're looking at one here, I would actually encourage you to go down the road of desensitization, okay? This is the time to start. In fact, if you wanted to say to me, okay, like, you see on Gardener's World, they say this week on Gardener's World, and they give them jobs to do. Well, if it was July in the world of dog behaviour, I was saying July, this is the time to think ahead so you can desensitize your dog to what's coming up in October, November, December, January, okay? So the sooner you can do this, the better. But I would start now nonetheless, and it is likely to help. I do get a lot of good feedback from this desensitization approach. Okay, good luck. Thank you. Kim.
Okay. This question's from Sarah Caldwell. My 2-year-old Jack Russell Cross Border Terrier has a major problem when I leave the house. She howls and cries even when I only go to the shop. I've had neighbours asking if she's hurt as she's so loud. Any ideas? I've tried putting on the radio and things like that, but that doesn't seem to work.
Separation anxiety. It's a really interesting subject. Not so interesting, of course, if you're struggling with dealing with it, but I have to confess I find it an interesting subject, largely because it plays into the realms of your relationship with the dog and how much access your dog has to you. It often is rather unscientific way of looking at it, but I often see it as a case of what I call over-bonding. We have dogs because, and we own dogs because they make such good pets. But it is easy to overbond with a pet by, for example, in no particular order, giving the dog unfettered access to you when you're sitting down on the sofa, or say allowing the dog to sleep on your feet at night or on your side, or for you to break some of the good rules that I would usually encourage people to address that, such as maybe sharing your food without any real rules around it. Now, forgive me, I'm again making some assumptions in the sense that I can't ask you questions, but in cases of separation anxiety, these are often areas that I find the owner is allowing the dog to do, and that in turn can lead to separation anxiety. Not definitely, but there is very often a correlation there. Anyway, we as always need to focus on how do we make things better. Leaving the radio on, yes, it helps, but as you've discovered, it's not really making a big impact on the dog. I would practice leaving the dog, and just as I was describing earlier for the dog travel scenario, we start at the beginning with very short durations of leaving the dog alone in this instance, and that as you believe the dog is coping better, we can extend those sessions. There are some little apps available that you can record just the audio of your dog's behaviour when you're out, because that I think will make a big difference. If you know that your dog is calm and relaxed when you leave him or her, that will be a big deal for you. Think about leaving your dog with a little hollow toy that you can stuff with some high value food, and just leave him alone for 5 minutes. Okay? You will need to see when you come back what, if any, impact he's made on that device. You can be a bit crafty, so for example, you can not feed the dog its breakfast and think, well, I'll do my leaving exercises mid-morning, and what you actually do is maybe make a mash up if it's dried food, or if it's a soft food, put it in that hollow toy and then give it to the dog. After 5 minutes, when you come back into the room, hopefully, best case scenario, your dog is oblivious to you and it's working on that toy. But when you come back into the room, ignore your dog completely. We need to show your dog that when you go and indeed return, that there's not a big deal made of it, and that it's important that you don't make a big deal around it as well. Practice, practice, practice. Look at the bigger picture and your relationship with the dog. If you feel that there are no rules and boundaries, then I would encourage you to have some sensible rules and boundaries put in place, okay? And that's the sort of thing you may need some additional help with. In the comments below, please offer me any feedback on that. Maybe just go ahead and run with those big ideas that I've given you and see how it goes. Once you know your dog can cope with 5 minutes being left alone, then go to 7, then go to 10, and then add on 5-minute increments, maybe once a week or maybe every few days, so that ultimately you feel that your dog can cope actually when left alone, and your recording of the dog's noises that you can review gives you that sort of first-hand evidence, because I think from what Kim was saying, you probably were not initially aware even that the dog was doing this. So I hope that helps you. I've just heard a little beep beep on my phone, which means it's 4 o'clock. We had an hour. I would like to say that I'm always conscious that there are numerous questions which go unanswered. I will this week go online and pick through those questions and answer them for you. But I apologise if we didn't get through them today. It's a case of trying to hit that balance between giving a good answer, that it's something that is legitimately helpful, and indeed then moving on to get to the next question. So thank you so much for tuning in, and I look forward to another Q&A with Facebook and Petplan in the very near future.